There are some stories that people talk about openly, and then there are stories that stay hidden for years. Not because they are small, but because they are uncomfortable. This is one of those stories. It doesn't begin with a powerful man. It doesn't begin with a famous name. It begins with someone ordinary, a man most people never heard of. On April 29, 1987, a man named William Ciccone was walking through his neighborhood in South Ozone Park, Queens. It was just another day. Cars parked along the street, people going about their routine. Nothing unusual. William was 36 years old. He worked as a carpenter. He lived a quiet life. He was not part of any gang. He had no connection to organized crime, no powerful friends, no protection. By all accounts, he was just trying to get through life like anyone else. But there was one thing people noticed about him. He struggled. Investigators later described him as someone dealing with mental health challenges, something that back then people didn't fully understand or support the way they do today. At that time, if you were struggling, you were mostly on your own. No system to help you, no one guiding you. And sometimes that meant being in places you shouldn't be. That afternoon, something happened near a small club on 101st Avenue. From the outside, it looked like nothing special, just a simple social club. Chairs inside, a TV in the corner, people sitting around talking. But in reality, it was much more than that. This place was known as the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, and it was not an ordinary hangout. It was where one of the most powerful figures in New York operated, a man named John Gotti. By 1987, Gotti was at the peak of his power. He wasn't just known, he was feared. He had built his name over years. Starting from a poor background in the Bronx, he worked his way up step by step. By the mid-1880s, he had taken control of the Gambino family, one of the most powerful crime groups in the country. His rise was bold, public, and impossible to ignore. Gotti didn't hide. In fact, he did the opposite. He dressed sharply, spoke confidently, walked like someone who knew no one could touch him. The media gave him a nickname that stuck, the Teflon Don, because no matter what happened, nothing seemed to stick to him. Cases came and went, charges were filed and dismissed. He always walked away. And that made him even more powerful. Because when people believe someone can't be stopped, they stop trying. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club became his base. From that small room, decisions were made every day. People came in and out constantly, and everyone understood one thing. This was not a place where mistakes were allowed. Now imagine this: a quiet street, a powerful man stepping outside his club, people around him watching, alert. And then, suddenly, a loud sound. No one knows exactly what that sound was, but in that moment, everything changed. People reacted fast, too fast, because in that world, hesitation could be dangerous, and suspicion was enough. Some of the men nearby believed something serious had just happened. They believed there had been a threat, and they started looking for someone to blame. That's when they saw William Ciccone. He was nearby, close enough, different enough, alone. What happened next took only minutes, but it changed everything. William didn't have bodyguards. He didn't have people ready to defend him. He didn't have anyone powerful to say, "Stop, you've got the wrong person." Instead, he had nothing. And in that moment, that was everything. He was chased, caught just a few blocks away. There was no investigation, no questions, no second chances. He was taken, forced into a car, and driven away from the only place he knew, from Queens towards Staten Island. At that point, his fate was already sealed, because the people involved were not going to take risks, not with something they believed could be a threat. And waiting on the other side was someone even more dangerous, a man named Joe Watts. Most people never heard of him, and that's exactly how he wanted it. He didn't seek attention. He didn't appear in headlines, but inside that world, his name carried weight. He was known as someone who handled problems quickly, quietly, and without hesitation. He didn't fit the traditional background of that world, but that didn't matter, because what mattered was trust and results. And Joe Watts had both. By the time William Ciccone was brought to him, this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was no longer about finding the truth. It had already become something else, a decision. And in that world, once a decision was made, it didn't change. William was held for hours, not minutes, hours. What happened during that time only a few people ever truly knew, and most of them never spoke about it. But one thing is clear. At the end of it, there was no way back. This wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about evidence. It was about belief. And in that world, belief was enough. By the time it was over, William Ciccone was gone. Not because of something he did, but because of where he was, when he was there, and who was around him. And that's what makes this story different. Because sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the next morning, the city moved on. People went to work. Shops opened. Traffic filled the streets. But somewhere on Staten Island, the truth was already lying still. William Ciccone's body was discovered in the basement of a small candy store. A quiet place. A normal place. The kind of place families visited without a second thought. But that morning, it became part of something much darker. The discovery raised questions immediately. How did he get there? Why that location? And who was responsible? Investigators began piecing things together. They traced his last known movements. They looked at where he was seen and who was nearby. Their attention quickly turned back to Queens, to the street near the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. There were signs, marks on the ground, witnesses who heard a loud noise, people who saw sudden movement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest something serious had happened there. Still, there was a problem. No one wanted to talk. In that world, silence wasn't just a choice. It was expected. People knew what could happen if they said the wrong thing or spoke to the wrong people. So the investigation slowed down. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And then, nothing. The case went cold. For years, there were no answers, no arrests, no clear story. Just a file sitting on a desk. Meanwhile, life continued for everyone else. The powerful stayed powerful. The people involved kept living their lives. And William Ciccone became just another forgotten name. But time has a way of changing things. Nearly a decade later, something shifted. One man decided to speak. His name was Dominic Borghese. He had once been part of that same world. He knew how it worked. He had seen things most people never would. And now, he was ready to talk. When he began working with authorities in the mid-1990s, old cases started opening again, including this one. For the first time, investigators heard details that had never been shared before. What happened that day? Who was involved? And how quickly everything escalated. According to his testimony, the situation had been based on a belief, not proof. A moment of suspicion that turned into a decision. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. In 1996, nearly 10 years after William's death, a grand jury finally brought charges against Joe Watts. It was a major step. For the first time, the case had real movement. But the legal process is not always simple. Watts denied the accusations. The case went to court, and in the end, he was not convicted for this specific incident. For many people, that felt like the story ended there. But it didn't. Years later, in a separate case, Joe Watts admitted involvement in another serious crime. He received a long prison sentence. A judge described him as someone deeply tied to a life of violence, someone who had spent years operating in a world where force was normal. He spent the rest of his life in prison and eventually passed away while in custody. John Gotti's story also came to an end. In the early 1990s, one of his closest associates decided to cooperate with authorities. That testimony changed everything. For years, Gotti had avoided consequences. Case after case, he walked free. But this time was different. He was convicted in court and sentenced to life in prison. The man once known as untouchable spent his final years behind bars. In 2002, he died while still in custody. And just like that, the most powerful figures in this story were gone. But the question remains, what about William Ciccone? He wasn't powerful. He wasn't famous. He didn't live a life that made headlines. He was just a man trying to get by. A carpenter. Someone dealing with personal struggles in a time when help was limited. He had no protection. No one to stand up for him. And on one ordinary day, he crossed paths with the wrong people. That was all it took. No long history. No deep conflict. Just a moment. A moment that changed everything. There were no big memorials for him. No major news coverage that lasted for years. But his name still exists. In reports. In records. In the quiet details of history. And maybe that matters. Because stories like this remind us of something important. Not every story is about power. Not every story is about famous names. Sometimes, the most important stories are about the people who had no power at all. People who were overlooked. People who were unprotected. People who deserved better. William Ciccone was one of those people. And even though the world moved on, his story didn't disappear. Now you know it too. If you want more real stories like this, simple, honest, and based on true events, make sure to follow. Because sometimes, the stories that were never meant to be told are the ones that matter most.